Hey LieLab friends! Today, I'm bringing you a full hour to take apart one by one the biggest lies you've been told your whole life. In school, at the cookout, on TV, in the group chat at work. And it's not your fault. We were all taught the same things with the same confident face. Myths about space, your body, animals, history, cars, movies, food, and even the words you say every single day. A full hour where more than once you're going to say, "No way, I believed that my whole life." Hit like, subscribe, and hold on tight, because the first one is already going to shake you up. You close your eyes, picture a carrot, and see it orange, obviously. Well, wrong. The first cultivated carrots, more than 1,000 years ago in the region of Persia and Afghanistan, were purple, yellow, and white. Orange isn't the original color, it's a later invention. It was only around the 16th century, in what is now Holland, that farmers started selecting and crossbreeding the most orange varieties until they became the standard. Before that, an orange carrot on your plate would have been extremely rare. Today, purple carrots are being sold again as if they were gourmet, when really they're the grandmothers of the species. The finer detail is that this shift to orange became fashionable in the Holland of the House of Orange, though historians still argue whether it was a tribute to the royal color or pure coincidence. The carrot you know isn't the classic one, it's the modern one. The orange color didn't come from the earth, it came from the catalog. Someone swore to you that the letters on the keyboard are scrambled on purpose to slow your fingers down so the old typewriter wouldn't jam. That's almost a lie, or at least a badly told one. The layout was put together by Christopher Scholes in the 1870s, and the goal wasn't to slow you down. It was to separate letters that were used together so the metal type bars wouldn't collide with each other on the way back. In practice, that actually let you type faster, not slower. Here's the fact. A bunch of supposedly more efficient alternative keyboards were tried out, and none of them managed to dethrone QWERTY because the whole world already had its fingers trained to it. They didn't slow you down on purpose. They arranged the keys so the machine wouldn't choke, and it stayed that way forever. You say the octopus has 8 tentacles and leave it at that. Wrong. The octopus has 8 arms, not tentacles. It sounds like a small thing, but for biology, it's not the same at all. Arms have suckers running along their entire length. Tentacles, on the other hand, are longer, with suckers mostly just at the tip. And they belong to other relatives like squid and cuttlefish, which have 2 tentacles in addition to their arms. The octopus has 0 tentacles and 8 matching arms. Here's the fact. Each octopus arm has a kind of mini brain of its own and can solve problems almost on its own. So next time you say octopus tentacles, correct yourself. And in case you still had doubts about how strange this creature is, it has 3 hearts and blue blood. It's 8 arms and each one thinks for itself. You hear yourself in the recording and think, "Ugh, the microphone is distorting my voice." False. The microphone isn't to blame. That voice from the recorder is your real voice, the one everyone else hears. The weird one is the one you hear when you speak. When you talk, you hear your own voice 2 ways at the same time, through the air and through the vibration of the bones in your skull. That internal vibration adds lower tones and body, making it sound fuller and deeper than it actually is. Here's the fact. When you're recorded, the part that travels through bone is lost, and that's why your real voice shows up higher pitched. Here's the wild part. That's why singers and broadcasters need to hear themselves recorded to train the voice that actually comes out, not the one they feel rumbling inside. The microphone isn't ruining you. It's finally showing you how the world hears you. You see a little spider web and think how fragile, I could break it with a finger. True that you can break it, but weak it is not. Pound for pound, spider silk is stronger than steel. Yes, you read that right. If you compare a strand of silk to a steel wire of the same weight, the silk withstands enormous tension, and on top of that it stretches without snapping, which steel doesn't do. It's one of the most impressive materials nature produces. Here's the fact. Scientists have spent years trying to copy it to make ultra-resistant vests and cables, and they still haven't gotten there. You break it because it's thin, not because it's weak. To give you an idea, if you could weave a spider web the thickness of a pencil, it would theoretically be able to stop an airplane in flight. Gram for gram, That spider is weaving something stronger than a steel beam. You'd assume the astronauts' footprints on the moon must have worn away long ago with time, like footprints in beach sand. False. They're still there, almost intact, more than 50 years later. There's no atmosphere on the moon, and without an atmosphere, there's no wind or rain to sweep anything away. Those footprints from Apollo 11 from 1969 stayed pressed into the lunar dust exactly as they were on day 1. The only thing that erodes them is micrometeorites. And they do it so slowly that the footprints are going to last for millions of years. Here's the fact. For that same reason, those footprints are going to outlast almost everything that happens on Earth, including us. Think about it for a second. While down here, the ocean erases your footprint in 2 waves. Up there, a footprint from half a century ago is still perfect, waiting. On the moon, nothing gets erased. Time up there barely passes at all. You hear crickets on a summer night and think they're just chirping for no reason. Background noise with no information in it. False, that chirping is a thermometer. Crickets are cold-blooded, so their metabolism depends on the heat of their surroundings. The higher the temperature, the faster they chirp. So much so that a guy named Amos Dolbear wrote a formula for it in 1897. You count the chirps over a short stretch of time, do a simple bit of math, and it gives you the temperature of the place, with a surprisingly good approximation. Here's the fact. On mild nights, the formula tends to be pretty accurate, and it works best with one very specific species of cricket. The cricket isn't just making noise, it's reading you the weather out loud, and you never once listened. You eat something spicy, your mouth catches fire, and you run for a glass of water. Classic mistake. Water not only doesn't help, it can actually make things worse. The culprit behind the burn is capsaicin, an oily substance that doesn't mix with water. When you drink water, you just spread it around your whole mouth instead of washing it away. What actually works is the fat in dairy. A glass of milk, a yogurt, or a piece of cheese contain a protein called casein that wraps around the capsaicin and pulls it away, like dish soap breaking down grease in a pan. Here's the fact. That's why spicy food around the world almost always comes with some kind of dairy on the side. Other tricks that do work are a bite of bread or rice, which soak up the spicy oil, or something sweet, which helps carry it away. Water spreads the fire around. Milk puts it out. Don't go anywhere yet, because later on, I'm going to ruin the way you look at the sky forever. You're going to see a sunset that's going to make you question everything. Stay with me. You're convinced that Wi-Fi is short for wireless fidelity, and it sounds logical. False. Wi-Fi isn't short for anything. It's a registered trademark, a brand name that in 1999 was commissioned from a branding consultancy called Interbrand, because IEEE 802.11b direct sequence wasn't going to fly with anyone at home. They picked Wi-Fi because it sounded similar to hi-fi, the old audio term, and that was it. The phrase wireless fidelity was invented afterward just to justify the name, and it doesn't even mean anything technical. Here's the fact. Not even the Wi-Fi Alliance itself uses that explanation today. This happens with a lot of tech names. They sound like engineering terms when really some advertiser invented them just because they sounded nice. They came up with a nice sounding name first, and the deep meaning never actually existed. Wi-Fi isn't short for anything. Wi-Fi is just really good marketing. You were told that snakes are stone deaf, and that's why snake charmers hypnotize them with movement instead of the flute. Half right, but more false than true. Snakes don't have external ears or a visible eardrum, and that's why we believed for decades that they couldn't hear a thing. Wrong. They have an inner ear, and they pick up vibrations from the ground as well as sound traveling through the air by way of the jawbone. In 2023, a study in Australia showed that snakes clearly react to airborne sounds, not just footsteps. They hear differently than you do, but they hear. In fact, the famous snake charmer doesn't hypnotize them with the music, since the snake is following the movement of the flute with its eyes and at most feels the vibrations. Here's an extra fact. That forked tongue snakes are constantly flicking out isn't for hearing or biting, it's for smelling the air and tracking prey. It's not that they're deaf, it's that they listen with their face pressed to the ground. You look at the standard map and swear Greenland is gigantic. almost the size of Africa. False, it's a trick of the map. The most common map, the Mercator projection, is great for navigation, but it distorts size, and the closer you get to the poles, the more it inflates things. That's why Greenland looks like a monster. The truth is, Africa is about 14 times bigger than Greenland. 14 times! Greenland covers around 800,000 square miles, and Africa covers more than 11.5 million. Here's the fact. On a true-to-scale map, Greenland comfortably fits inside a single large African country. The same thing happens with Antarctica, which on the map looks like a giant white strip stretched from one side to the other, when in reality it's much smaller than it appears. It's not that Greenland is enormous, it's that the map blows it up, so the round Earth can fit onto a flat rectangular sheet. You say, I lost my internet, and the website won't load as if they were twins. They're not. Completely false. The internet is the physical network. The cables, the antennas, the servers, all the infrastructure that connects machines around the planet. The World Wide Web is just one of the things that lives inside that network, the one made up of the pages you open in your browser. Email, online video games, and the voice messages you send all use the internet, but they aren't the web. Here's the fact that seals it. The internet got started in 1969 with ARPANET, and the web wasn't invented by Tim Berners-Lee until 1989, 20 years later. The web showed up 20 years late to its own party. Here's another fact to keep in mind. Today there are huge services, like the apps you use on your phone, that run over the internet and don't even go through the traditional browser-based web. The internet is the building. The web is just one tenant renting a floor. You draw a planet with rings and you already know it's Saturn, because it's the only one, right? Wrong. Saturn has the biggest and brightest rings, the ones you can spot right away with any toy telescope, and that's why it got all the fame. But it's not alone in that club. Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune also have ring systems. They're just much thinner, darker, and harder to see. Jupiter's rings are made of almost transparent dust and weren't confirmed until the Voyager probe in 1979. Here's a nice fact. Even some small asteroids have their own tiny rings, something we only discovered a few years ago, and it blew our minds. And by the way, Saturn's rings aren't solid. They're millions of pieces of ice and rock spinning around, from grains of sand up to rocks the size of a house. Saturn isn't the king of the ring, it's just the one that put on the thickest one. You think of potatoes, and you think of Ireland, of stew, of the famine, of everything Irish. It's the opposite of what you'd think. The potato is South American, 100% ours. It was domesticated more than 7,000 years ago in the Andes, in what is now Peru and Bolivia, long before any Irishman even knew it existed. The Spanish brought it to Europe in the 16th century, and there, centuries later, it became the backbone of Irish food. Here's a mind-bending fact. In the Andes, there are more than 4,000 varieties of native potato. And one more. When it arrived in Europe, a lot of people distrusted it and used it as an ornamental plant, until hunger changed their minds all at once. Ireland gave it its fame. The Andes gave it the potato. The queen of European cuisine was born speaking Quechua. You've heard Mayday, Mayday 1,000 times in movies, and always assumed it was just some English word, or something about the month of May. False, and the origin is beautiful. Mayday comes from French. In 1923, a radio operator at a London airport needed a distress word that would be clearly understood between English speakers and French speakers. Because almost all the air traffic crossed the channel, he chose the sound of Mayday, or Venez m'aider, which in French means help me. Written out in English, it became Mayday. Here's the fact. It's said 3 times in a row, specifically, so nobody confuses it with some random phrase inside a normal conversation. It's not a date or a month. It's a call for help in French, disguised as an English word. You see a little bird sitting calmly on a high-voltage wire and figure it's safe because its feet have some kind of rubber coating or something. Completely false. The bird doesn't have anything insulating on its feet. It's safe because it's only touching one wire, and for electricity to pass through you, it needs a difference, an entry point, and an exit point. 2 spots at different voltage, with both feet on the same wire. There's nowhere for the current to flow, so it just keeps moving along the wire. Here's the key fact. If that same bird touched the wire and a grounded pole at the same time, it would get electrocuted instantly. In fact, the birds that do get hurt are large ones like storks, which spread their wings so wide they end up touching 2 wires at once, and that's when they complete the circuit. It's not rubber that saves it. It's not being a bridge. Mars is the red planet, so the sky and the sunsets on Mars should be super red, right? Just the opposite. During the day, the sky on Mars leans toward an orangish-brown color because of the dust suspended in the air. But at sunset, something amazing happens. The sky around the sun turns blue. That's the exact opposite of what happens on Earth, where the day sky is blue and the sunset turns red. That happens because the extremely fine particles of Martian dust scatter light in the opposite way our atmosphere does. Here's the fact. NASA's rovers, like Curiosity, have photographed those blue sunsets. And it's not a trick, it's real. Picture yourself standing on Mars with the whole orange landscape around you, and right there, the sun going down wrapped in a sky blue halo. On Mars, the reddest planet in the solar system, the sun says goodbye in blue. I told you I was going to change how you see the sky. Someone told you that newborns see everything flipped, upside down, until the brain sorts the image out. Myth. It's true that the eye projects an inverted image onto the retina, but that happens to all of us, to you too right now, and the brain just interprets it right side up without any drama. The baby doesn't see things upside down. What actually happens is that they see blurry and within a short range. A newborn focuses well only at around 8 to 12 inches, exactly the distance to the face of whoever is holding them. Here's the fact. Their visual sharpness is so low that if they were an adult, they'd be sent straight to the eye doctor for a pair of very thick glasses. And there's more. At first they can tell strong contrasts, like black and white, apart much better than soft colors. The baby doesn't see the world flipped over. They see it right side up close and through a haze. You clear your browser history and feel like you've vanished, like nobody knows where you've been anymore. Big lie. Clearing your history only wipes the record kept on your own device. Nothing more. Your internet provider still saw every page you opened. The network at work or at school did too. And the sites you visited logged you all the same, whether you were signed in or not. Here's the fact. The browser keeps that history for you, not for the world. So clearing it is like tearing a page out of your own diary while 10 witnesses are standing outside taking notes. To actually hide what you look at and who you message really takes a lot more than that one button, and even then you're not fully covered. You don't become invisible, you just hide the trail from the one person you least care about seeing it. Yourself. You know snails are slow. What you don't know is how far its ability to hit pause actually goes. A snail can fall asleep literally for years. It's not ordinary sleep. It's called estivation when it happens due to heat and drought, or hibernation when it happens due to cold. It seals the opening of its shell with a hardened layer of mucus, drops its metabolism to almost nothing, and waits. It waits for months, in extreme cases. Under very dry conditions, snails have been documented surviving for years in that state and waking up once humidity returned. Here's the fact. There's a famous case of a snail that came back to life after spending years stuck to a museum display car. It's not that it's slow. It's that it plays on a completely different time scale, and sometimes it takes a vacation lasting several years. You put it in your salad, you spread it on savory toast, and you filed it away as a vegetable. Botanically false. Avocado is a fruit, and not just any fruit. Technically, it's a berry because it grows from the ovary of the flower and has one huge seed inside. That pit we all try to sprout in a glass with toothpicks. Eating it as something savory doesn't change what it actually is. Tomatoes, cucumbers, and bell peppers are in the same boat, fruits that we treat as vegetables. Here's the fact. Avocado is so fatty and so caloric that it's basically like butter, just plant-based butter shaped like a fruit. So when you ask for something green and healthy, you're asking for a giant fruit disguised as a salad. You were taught that Gutenberg invented the printing press, and that's the end of the story. Mid-15th century. Half right. Gutenberg was a genius, sure, but printing with a movable type already existed in the East long before him. In China, around the year 1040, a man named Bi Sheng printed with ceramic type, and in Korea they printed a book using movable metal type, the jikji, in 1377, decades before Gutenberg built his press. What the German did do was combine metal type, a special ink, and a mechanical press into a system that revolutionized Europe. Here's the fact. He didn't invent the idea, he perfected it and put it into mass production, printing his famous Bible around 1455. What is true is that his European version set off an explosion of books that changed history forever. He didn't light the spark, he built the engine around it. You're convinced that somewhere on the company's servers there's someone or something listening to every voice message you send. False, at least when it comes to the content. WhatsApp has used what's called end-to-end encryption since 2016. That means the message gets locked with a key on your phone and only unlocks on the recipient's phone. Neither WhatsApp nor Meta can read or listen to what's inside because they don't have the key. Keep in mind, they do handle the other data, who you talk to, when, how often, and that's a whole different matter. Here's the fact, that mathematical lock is so strong that even if someone forcibly took the phone, they couldn't decrypt old messages just like that. And it's not exclusive. That same type of encryption is used by banks and the most serious messaging apps. It's not magic, it's pure math. The content travels locked up. What surrounds the content? Now that's where you should pay attention. You say desert and picture dunes, blazing sun and camels, and that's where you place the biggest desert on Earth. False. The largest desert on the planet is Antarctica. Yes, that continent of ice. A desert isn't defined by heat or by sand, it's defined by how little water falls from the sky. And in Antarctica, it almost never rains or snows. It's bone dry. It covers around 5.5 million square miles of frozen desert. The Sahara, the largest hot desert, comes in second. Here's the fact. There are areas of Antarctica where no precipitation has fallen in millions of years. And it's not alone, the second largest desert is also cold, the Arctic. The famous sandy deserts like the Sahara actually come after both of those. Desert isn't a synonym for heat. It's a synonym for thirst, and the thirstiest place in the world is frozen solid. You already know the platypus is a really strange creature with a duck's bill and a beaver's tail. But here's something you didn't know. The platypus doesn't have a stomach. None at all. Its esophagus connects almost directly to the intestine without that acidic pouch most of us have. At some point in its evolution, it simply lost the organ because its diet of soft, thin-shelled little creatures didn't need much acidity. And it's not alone. There are dozens of fish species that also went without a stomach. Here's the fact. On top of that, the male has venomous spurs on its hind legs, and the female lays eggs despite being a mammal. It's not missing a piece. It evolved so comfortably that it decided digesting with acid was an unnecessary luxury. You'd think sound moves more freely through air than it gets stuck in water, right? Just the opposite. Sound travels much faster through water than through air. In air, it moves at about 1,125 feet per second. In water, it moves at around 4,850 feet per second, more than 4 times faster. The reason is that in water, the molecules are packed closer together and pass the vibration from one to the next, almost without losing any time. Here's the fact. In metal, sound travels even faster, which is why pressing your ear to the train tracks lets you hear the train coming long before the sound reaches you through the air. Sound doesn't hate water, it loves it. It flies through it. You're going to think I'm messing with you. I'm not. The wombat, that little chunky bear-like Australian animal, produces cube-shaped droppings. Little squares with flat sides. And it's not a random quirk, it serves a purpose. The wombat marks its territory by stacking its droppings on rocks and logs. And if they were round, they'd roll off. Being cube-shaped, they stay put wherever it leaves them. For years, nobody understood how it managed that, until researchers studied its intestine and discovered that the final section has areas of different elasticity, some stiffer and some more flexible, which shape the contents like a little factory. Here's the fact. That discovery even won a scientific award, and today it's being studied to help design new materials. It's not a funny coincidence. It's intestinal engineering, so the little marker doesn't roll downhill. When you picture explorers with a compass, you imagine European ships crossing the ocean. Wrong on the origin. The magnetic compass was invented by the Chinese. Back in the Han Dynasty, they already used lodestone to find direction, and by the 11th century in the Song Dynasty, they were using it for real navigation. Europeans only adopted it centuries later, once the invention reached them through trade routes. Here's the fact. The earliest Chinese compasses were a little lodestone spoon spinning on a plate, which always ended up pointing south. Columbus and everyone who came after him sailed with borrowed technology from China. The needle that guided Europe across the oceans had been born on the other side of the world. Hang on, it's about to get good. Coming up, I'm going to ruin a fruit you've been eating since you were a kid, and it turns out it isn't even what you think it is. No more spoilers. Hit like if I've already busted a myth for you, and let's keep going. There's an idea floating around that women have one extra rib, or men one fewer because of that old biblical story. Anatomically false. Men and women have exactly the same number of ribs, 12 pairs each, 24 total. There's no difference by sex in that number. There is one quirk. Some people are born with a small extra rib near the neck, called a cervical rib, but that happens to men and women equally, and it's uncommon. Any X-ray confirms it in 2 seconds flat. Same bones on both sides for everyone. The missing rib is an old tale. In the real body, they're all there for everybody. Since Brazil and Colombia are the kings of coffee, you assume that's where the plant came from. False. Coffee originated in Africa, more precisely in the region of Kaffa in Ethiopia, which many believe is even where the name comes from. From there it moved to the Arabian Peninsula, to Yemen, where people began cultivating and roasting it seriously. It didn't arrive in the Americas until much later, only in the 18th century, brought over by Europeans. Here's the fact. Legend has it that an Ethiopian goat herder discovered the effect of coffee after seeing his goats jumping around wildly after eating the little red berries. Brazil and Colombia produce it like crazy today, but the plant is African. Your morning cup of coffee has an Ethiopian passport, not a South American one. You were sold on the idea that with a VPN you become a ghost, that nobody in the world can ever track you. Exaggerated and false. A VPN does something concrete and useful. It hides your traffic from your internet provider and disguises your location by changing the address you appear to be coming from. But invisible not at all. The company that provides your VPN can see what you're doing. If you're going to be suspicious of anyone, start there. And websites still recognize you if you log in through cookies and other markers tied to your device. Here's the fact. There are tracking techniques that can identify your browser even if you switch countries. A VPN covers one window. It doesn't erase you from the map. No app sells total anonymity no matter what the ad promises. You've got it stuck in your head that the older the wine, the better, that storing it is like keeping a treasure. False for almost all of them. Only a very small percentage of the world's wines, something like 1%, are actually made to age and improve over time. The vast majority is made to be drunk young, within a year or two. And if you keep it too long, it turns to vinegar, loses its fruit, and goes bad. Here's the fact. That ordinary bottle you set aside for a special occasion 10 years ago in the cupboard is probably already ruined. Aging an ordinary wine doesn't make it refined. It kills it slowly. Age isn't a guarantee. It's a gamble you almost always lose. Movies taught you that an active security camera has a little red light blinking, and that if it's not blinking, it's fake. Just the opposite. In real life, it's almost the reverse. Real cameras, the good ones, usually don't have any light that gives them away, precisely so they don't announce where they're looking. The ones with a flashy, blinking red light are often the fake ones. Plastic decoys put up to scare people off, and they add that light so they look like they're on. Here's the fact. A real camera trying to stay unnoticed is the last thing that's going to have a glowing sign on top of it. Notice next time, professional cameras at a bank or a big store almost never have that little disco light blinking away. That little red light doesn't confirm you're being recorded. A lot of the time, it confirms exactly the opposite. You peel a shrimp, rip off its head, and toss it without thinking twice. Well, you just threw away its heart, and its stomach, and a good chunk of the animal's important organs. In shrimp and prawns, what we call the head is actually the cephalothorax, a piece that fuses the head with the thorax. In there is packed almost everything: the heart, the stomach, and the gills. The tail, which is the only part we usually eat, is pretty much pure muscle. Here's the fact. That heart is tucked away so high up and so hidden that for centuries plenty of people ate shrimp without ever realizing what they were chewing on. You didn't rip off its head, you ripped off half its body, heart included. You've heard so much about quantum computers that you think they're already inside the latest commercial smartphones. Not even close. Real quantum computers are enormous laboratory machines that, to function, need to be cooled down to temperatures close to absolute zero, colder than outer space. They take up entire rooms and cost fortunes. There's not a single one tucked inside a phone, and there won't be for a very long time. What you have in your pocket is a classical computer. Powerful, but classical. Here's the fact. Those quantum machines are so delicate that the tiniest vibration or bit of heat can ruin the calculation. Your phone is incredibly fast, but there's nothing quantum about it. For now, quantum lives in a freezer the size of a room. Since the word taxi sounds the same in half the world, you assume it's an English word that got exported. False! Taxi is the short form of taximeter, the little device that measures the price of the ride. And taximeter comes from the Latin taxa, meaning tax or fee, plus the Greek metron, meaning measure. In other words, fair measurer. The name became popular in Europe in the early 20th century, along with the invention of the device. That's why it sounds similar in so many languages. They all borrowed the same root at around the same time. Here's the fact. In the huge number of countries, the word came in almost unchanged, not because of English, but because of the machine that charged for the ride. Taxi isn't English. It's a device with a Greek and Latin name that hopped into every car in the world. You go to the store, see green tea on one side and black tea on the other, and assume they're different plants, like an apple and a pear. False. They come from exactly the same plant. It's called Camellia sinensis, and from that single species come green tea, black tea, white tea, oolong, and pu'er. The only thing that changes is what they do to the leaf after picking it. If they dry it quickly and stop the oxidation, you get green tea. If they let it oxidize fully, it turns dark brown and you get black tea. It's the same chemical process that makes a cut apple turn brown in the air. Here's the fact, mate, and chamomile tea don't count. Those really are different plants, which is why technically they're herbal infusions rather than tea. They're not rival plants. It's the same leaf, just given a different amount of time. You're one of those people with 30 tabs open, and you swear it doesn't affect your computer at all. False! Every open tab uses up memory and often processing power too. Especially if the page has videos, ads, or things that keep updating in the background. The more tabs, the more memory gets used up, and once memory fills up, the machine starts crawling. Here's the fact. Some browsers show you how much memory each tab is eating, and you might get a nasty surprise from just one heavy page left open. Keeping your browser packed with tabs isn't free. Every tab is a tenant paying rent and resources from your computer. Close the ones you're not using and you'll feel it breathe again. You use the phrase to mean that if you chose something yourself, it doesn't bother you. Actually, this comes from a different saying that gets cut short too often. There's an old saying that goes something like, "A chosen burden doesn't weigh," but the fuller version keeps going and adds something like, "Still, it's a burden." And that last part changes the entire meaning. It's not that what we choose never hurts. It's that even though we chose it willingly, it can still bother us. It can still be hard. The second part adds realism to the first. Here's the fact: this happens to a lot of sayings. They got worn down through use, and we lost exactly the part that completed them. Taken alone, the saying is only half true. The full phrase warns you that even what you choose can still weigh on you. Since almost everything modern seems American, you place the first ATM in the United States. False. The first ATM in history opened in London, England in 1967 at a branch of Barclays Bank. It was designed by an engineer named John Shepherd Barron, who, as the story goes, came up with the idea while taking a bath, thinking about how to get cash when the bank was closed. At first, it didn't work with a plastic card like today, but with special vouchers instead. Here's the fact. An actor from a famous show of that era was the first person to use it in public for the photo op. The ATM wasn't born in New York. It was born in London, from a guy who wanted his money on a Sunday and couldn't get it. Since emojis show emotions, happy face, sad face, you assume the word comes from emotion. Total coincidence and false. Emoji is a Japanese word. It's formed from e, meaning picture or image, and moji, meaning character or letter. In other words, picture character or drawn letter. Emojis were born in Japan in the late 1990s. For phones over there, the fact that emoji sounds so much like emotion and emoticon in our language is pure phonetic coincidence, a lucky collision between two languages. Here's the fact: emoticons made out of symbols, like a colon and a parenthesis, are a different thing entirely and are older. Emoji doesn't talk about feelings through its name. It talks about drawings in Japanese. You hum or play Beethoven's Für Elise and just assume an Elise existed. Maybe not. The original score was lost, and the piece wasn't published until 1867, more than 30 years after Beethoven had already passed away, thanks to a scholar named Ludwig Noll. The strongest theory says that Noll misread Beethoven's handwritten note, which was a mess to begin with, and that the dedication actually said for Thérèse Malfatti, a woman the composer had feelings for. Here's the fact: Thérèse and Elise, badly written and even more badly read, can easily get mixed up in that kind of handwriting. So the most famous romantic piano piece in the world might, because of a reading mistake, have carried the wrong name for a century and a half. You know, a day is one full spin of a planet on its own axis, and a year is one full trip around the sun, and you assume the day is always shorter. On Venus, it isn't. Venus spins on its own axis at an agonizingly slow pace. It takes about 243 Earth days to complete just one rotation, but it takes about 225 days to go around the sun. In other words, over there, the day is longer than the year. And on top of that, it spins backward compared to almost every other planet, so if you could stand there, you'd see the sun rise in the west. Here's the fact: it spins so slowly that its surface at the equator moves at the pace of a leisurely bike ride, while that same spot on Earth moves at more than 1,000 miles per hour. On Venus, you could have 2 birthdays without the day ever ending. Don't stop now, because a big stretch is coming up. Later on, I'm going to take apart something you learned as a kid that's actually the exact opposite of what you believe. Drop it in the comments if you've already guessed it. And let's keep going with that fruit I promised you. You bite into a strawberry and think, what a tasty fruit. Yes and no. Botanically, the strawberry is a false fruit, or accessory fruit. The juicy red part you eat isn't the plant's fruit, it's a swollen part of the flower stem. So where are the real fruits? They're those little dots you think are seeds, the ones that get stuck in your teeth. Each one of those little grains is, technically, a tiny fruit with a seed inside. In other words, a single strawberry isn't one fruit. It's more like 200 tiny fruits sitting on top of a sweet base. Here's the fact: That's why botanists call it an aggregate fruit. And while we're at it, pineapple isn't a single fruit either. It's the fusion of a whole bunch of little fruits packed tightly around a central core. You've been eating 200 fruits in one bite and thought it was just one. They lied to you even about your afternoon snack. You switch off the router before going to bed, convinced you're saving a ton of electricity. Barely anything really. A home router uses very little power, somewhere around 5 to 10 watts, similar to a small low-consumption light bulb. Leaving it on all night adds up to a ridiculously small cost. Just a few cents a month on your bill. That's not where your electricity bill is coming from. Here's the fact. The refrigerator, the water heater, the air conditioner, and the iron use tens or hundreds of times more power than that little device. If you really want to save money, look at the big appliances. Not the router. Turning off the Wi-Fi at night might have other benefits, but lowering your electric bill isn't one of them. You repeat that English is the most spoken language on the planet and leave it at that. It depends how you count it, and that's where it falls apart. If you count people who speak it as a native language, Mandarin Chinese wins by a landslide, with more than 900 million native speakers. English as a native language ranks quite a bit lower. Now, if you add in everyone who speaks it as a second language, that's where English does climb to first place overall, because half the world studies it. Here's the fact. Spanish, by the way, has more native speakers than English. So the most spoken isn't a simple truth. Among native speakers, Mandarin wins. Overall, including everyone who learned it, English wins. It all changes depending on what you're counting. You blindly trust the speedometer and think it shows your exact speed down to the mile per hour. Half true. By regulation, speedometers are built to read a bit high, never low, for safety reasons. In other words, when the dashboard says 100, it's very likely that you're actually going a little slower. Something like 90-something in reality. It's designed that way on purpose, so you never end up going faster than you think you are. Here's the fact. That difference is usually just a few miles per hour, and it's legal in nearly every country in the world. The speedometer isn't lying to you by mistake. It's exaggerating on purpose to protect you from yourself. You think of a country and picture one time, the time in that country. With Russia, that idea falls apart. Russia is so ridiculously wide that it has 11 different time zones. 11 when people in its easternmost city, right by the Pacific, are already sitting down for dinner. It's still mid-morning in the capital. And it's not just Russia if you count overseas territories. France actually holds the world record for the most time zones, way more than Russia, spread across every ocean. Here's the fact. There are points in Russia that are closer to Alaska than to their own capital. So much so that in the Bering Strait, there are 2 small islands separated by just a few miles and almost an entire day's difference in time. There's no such thing as Russia's time zone. There are 11, and all of them are equally Russian. To wrap up, here's a lovely origin story. Someone told you the sweet anecdote that in 1947, a moth got into a computer, jammed it up, and ever since, computer errors have been called bugs. Half right, and the part that falls apart is exactly the origin part. The moth was real. That part is true. It was found stuck in a relay of a giant computer at Harvard. They pulled it out and taped it into the logbook with a funny note. But the word bug, used for technical glitches, was already in use long before that, decades earlier, even showing up in letters written by Thomas Edison himself about problems in his own inventions. Here's the fact. The charm of the story was precisely that. For once, the bug was an actual bug. And the joke only works because the word already existed. The moth didn't name anything. It just crawled into a word that had already been around for years. You find a nice photo online and think, if it doesn't say anything, it must be free. I can use it for whatever I want. False and risky. By default, almost everything someone creates, a photo, a drawing, a piece of writing, a video, has copyright protection from the very moment it's created, with no need for any notice or little symbol to appear anywhere. Just because it's floating around online doesn't make it free or ownerless. To use it comfortably, you need permission. a license, or you need to look for material that explicitly says it's free to use. Here's the fact. Using someone else's image in something commercial can land you a lawsuit or a nasty fine. There's no lawless territory on the internet. Almost everything has an owner, even if it doesn't bark. Since they sound so similar, you say Spanish and Portuguese are basically the same and that you and a Brazilian would understand each other with no problem. Half right, leaning toward false. They're two separate languages, each with its own grammar, its own pronunciation, and plenty of words that don't match up or mean completely different things. They share a Latin root, which is why they look similar in writing, but spoken at full speed, they're a whole different story, especially Portuguese with its nasal sounds. Here's the fact. There are a lot of tricky words that are spelled the same but mean something totally different. And that's exactly where you get caught out. They're like close cousins, but cousins, not twins. Assuming it's the same thing is the direct path to a misunderstanding. You are shown the solar system drawn like this. The sun fixed and still at the center, with all the planets obediently circling around it. Almost. With Jupiter, things get a little strange. When two bodies orbit each other, they're actually both circling a shared balance point, a kind of common center of gravity. With Earth, that point sits so far inside the sun that you don't notice anything at all. But Jupiter is so incredibly massive, more than double the weight of all the other planets combined, that this balance point actually ends up just outside the sun's surface. Here's the fact. That means the sun and Jupiter orbit around an empty point in space, and it makes the sun visibly wobble because of it. Jupiter isn't circling the sun. The two of them are dancing arm in arm around a point where there's nothing at all. You see a piano? You know it has strings inside, and you lump it in with the guitar and the violin. Incomplete. It does have strings, sure, but it makes sound in a way that's nothing like those other instruments. Experts call it a struck chordophone, and some classify it right alongside percussion instruments. The difference is in how the sound is produced. On a guitar, you pluck the string. On a violin, you rub it with a bow. On a piano, when you press a key, it triggers a small lever that flings a felt-covered hammer to strike the string. Strike it! Here's the fact. That mechanism was invented by Bartolomeo Cristofori around the year 1700, and it's what allowed players to hit a note loud or soft depending on the force of their finger, something its predecessor, the harpsichord, couldn't do. You're not stroking strings. Every note you play on a piano is, technically, a perfectly tuned hammer strike. You imagine that every alphabet in the world has more or less the same number of letters. Somewhere in the 20s like ours. False, it varies a lot. Spanish has around 27 letters counting the N. English has 26. Italian uses just 21 letters in its basic alphabet. And there are languages with a lot more or a lot fewer. Hawaiian, for example, gets by with just 13 letters. Here's the fact. On the other end of the spectrum, there are writing systems with thousands of characters. Like Chinese, which doesn't even work with letters the way ours does. There's no universal alphabet. Every language built its own toolbox, and some filled it up, while others kept it lean and to the point. In your head, computers and the internet are basically the same as Microsoft, so surely they get some credit for inventing it? False. Microsoft didn't invent the internet. Not even close. The foundations of the network were laid by scientists like Vinton Cerf and Robert Kahn, who in the 1970s created the set of rules that lets machines communicate with each other. The web, as we already said, was made by Tim Berners-Lee. Microsoft showed up quite a bit later, first with its operating system and then with a browser to hop onto something that was already up and running. Here's the fact. For years, Microsoft barely paid attention to the internet and had to scramble to catch up so it wouldn't get left behind. They didn't invent it. They arrived late to a party that was already in full swing and started handing out drinks. In school, they drew you the airplane wing and told you that the air on top has to travel a longer path, so it speeds up to reunite with the air below, and that speed creates lower pressure that lifts you up. Sounds nice. It's incomplete and in part flat out false. The air on top does move faster, but not because it's running late to meet up with anything. In fact, it arrives way ahead of time, and the air molecules never actually reunite at all. The wing generates lift because it deflects air downward, and by action and reaction, that air pushes the wing upward. Here's the fact. That's why a plane can fly upside down, which would be impossible if lift depended only on the curved shape of the wing. It's not that the air is racing to arrive on time. It's that the wing throws air down toward the ground, and the ground throws the favor right back. You trust your phone's automatic brightness, thinking it's always what saves the most battery. Not always. Automatic brightness adjusts the screen based on the ambient light, and that's its whole selling point. But when you're out in the sun or somewhere very bright, in order for you to see anything, it cranks the brightness all the way up, and at that point it eats more battery than if you just left a fixed, lower brightness. The screen is one of the components that drains the most energy on your phone. Here's the fact. In a lot of cases, a fixed moderate brightness uses less power than letting the automatic setting push it all the way up under the sun. Automatic mode is comfortable for your eyes, sure, but for your battery, a low, manually set brightness usually wins out. You were told that Wall Street gets its name from a wall the Dutch colonists built for defense, and that's where wall comes from. Half right. There really was a wooden barrier built by the Dutch in 1653 in Old New Amsterdam, and the street running alongside it was called de Waalstraat. Up to that point, true. The doubtful part is the heroic angle. The wall wasn't so much a great fortress against attacks as it was a boundary and control barrier, which also kept livestock from wandering off. Here's the fact. By 1699, it had already been torn down, and only the name remained. Wall Street did have its wall, but it was more of a farm fence than a wartime fortress. As a kid, you were taught that the pelican uses that huge throat pouch like a pantry to store fish and eat it later. False, and it's actually the opposite of practical. That pouch, called the gular pouch, isn't a lunchbox. It's a fishing net. The pelican opens it underwater like a giant bucket, scoops up fish along with a huge amount of water all at once, then drains the water out through the sides of its bill before finally swallowing the catch. It's a hunting tool, not a storage tool. Here's the fact. That pouch can hold several gallons of water in a single scoop, way more than would even fit in its stomach. It doesn't store food for later. It fishes with a scoop made of skin and eats right away. This was the one I promised you. Did you guess it? You think Twitter's old 140-character limit was a design decision, made so the text would look neat and short on screen. False. That number came from the old text messages, the SMS on your phone, which had a technical limit of 160 characters. Twitter was born very closely tied to text messaging, and it reserved about 20 characters for the username, leaving you with 140 to write. Purely practical math, not aesthetics. Here's the fact. Once Twitter broke away from SMS and grew, over the years it ended up doubling that limit to 280. The 140 wasn't an artistic choice. It was the mathematical inheritance of the little text message from your dad's old flip phone with buttons. You picture them in your head crossing swords, feathered hats and all, shouting, "All for one." But stop for a second and think about the name, Musketeers. Doesn't musket ring a bell? That's exactly the point. Musketeers were, first and foremost, a body of soldiers defined by their use of the musket, a long and heavy firearm of the time. The sword was the backup, what they pulled out once the musket was already fired, or the fight got too close for comfort. Here's the fact. Reloading a musket back then could take quite a while, so the blade was there to cover exactly that gap. They're called musketeers because of the musket, not the rapier. The name was right in front of you this whole time. You think the longest word in the dictionary is a fixed fact, as if it were the same in every language. False. Every language builds its words differently, so the longest one changes completely from one language to another. German, for example, strings nouns together one after another, and forms extremely long words that describe a single thing. Finnish does something similar by chaining endings together. In Spanish, we have long words too, but we play a different game. Here's the fact. In some languages, you can invent almost infinite words just by adding little pieces, and none of them could officially be the longest because you can always add one more. There's no universal champion. Every language has its own monster made of letters, and they don't look anything alike. You upload your photos to the cloud, and somewhere in your mind you picture servers floating up there, among the actual clouds. Sweet idea, but false. The cloud has nothing airborne about it. It's made up of enormous, incredibly heavy warehouses packed with computers running 24 hours a day, firmly planted on the ground in different countries around the world. When you save something to the cloud, what you're really doing is sending it to a hard drive sitting inside one of those buildings, maybe thousands of miles away from you. Here's the fact. Those data centers use so much electricity and generate so much heat that they need enormous cooling systems just to keep from melting down. In fact, some companies build them in cold countries or even underwater, specifically to spend less on cooling them. The cloud isn't in the sky. It's in a warehouse running the air conditioning at full blast, firmly attached to the ground. Driving school taught you to hold the steering wheel at 10 and 2, like the hands of a clock, and it's stuck as a rule forever. Outdated. Today the recommendations have changed because of the airbag. With your hands up that high, if the airbag goes off, it slams into your face and wrists with brutal force. That's why the advice now is to hold the wheel lower, at 9 and 3, or even a bit lower than that. That way, if the airbag deploys, your hands get thrown off to the sides instead of straight into you. Here's the fact. That airbag inflates in a fraction of a second at very high speed. It's not some soft little cushion. The 10 and 2 rule was from a time before airbags. The car changed, and so should your hands. You think the AT symbol, that little curled A, was born along with email and the digital age. False, it's actually ancient. The at symbol has existed for centuries. It was a unit of weight in the Spanish-speaking world, the arroba, and it was also used in commerce to mean at such and such a price each. It sat there, on keyboards and typewriters, gathering dust. In 1971, an engineer named Ray Tomlinson was looking for a symbol to separate the username from the machine name and email, and he grabbed the AT symbol precisely because almost nobody used it, and it wouldn't get confused with names. Here's the fact. He picked it purely because it was convenient and out of the way. The internet didn't invent the at symbol. The internet rescued an old symbol that was just sitting around decoratively and gave it the job of its life. You assume driving rules are more or less the same in any country, that a traffic light is just a traffic light. False. They vary enormously. In about 70-something countries, people drive on the left, with the steering wheel on the other side, like in England, Japan, or Australia. Speed limits, right-of-way, horn use, fines. All of it changes from one side of a border to the other. There are places where turning on a red light is completely normal and others where it's a serious violation. Here's the fact. In some countries, even the colors and the details of the signs don't fully match up. Driving abroad using your own country's rules is a guaranteed recipe for disaster. There's no worldwide manual. There's a map full of completely different rule sets. You think that content that disappears after 24 hours is some deep, sacred artistic concept. Let's dial that back a notch. The disappearing content format was popularized by Snapchat in 2013, and Instagram copied it afterward in 2016, name and all. The 24 hours isn't some cosmic truth. It's a product decision, a round number chosen so people would post without fear of permanent embarrassment, and so you'd keep coming back to check every day. Pure engagement psychology. Here's the fact. It worked so well that today almost every social network has its own version of the same thing. Stories don't last a day out of poetry. They last a day so they can get you opening the app again every morning. You're convinced that if you don't pay for an expensive antivirus, your computer is basically defenseless. and that free ones are useless. False. Free antivirus programs, including the one already built into many modern operating systems, offer solid baseline protection against the most common threats. The difference with paid versions usually lies in the extras, additional features like parental controls, network tools, or support, not so much in the core detection itself. Here's the fact. In a lot of independent tests, free solutions catch a huge share of threats, very similar to the paid ones. You're not unprotected just because you didn't pay up. What protects you most isn't how much you spent. It's not clicking on random suspicious things that land in your inbox. To wrap things up, let's go back to the very beginning. You'd assume the first message ever sent over the internet was an email. The most logical guess. False. The first message sent over ARPANET, the network that became the mother of the internet, was sent in 1969 between two universities in California. They wanted to transmit the word login. They only managed to get through the first two letters, L and O, before the system crashed. So the first message in history was, by accident, the syllable LO. Email came later, only in the early 1970s. Here's the fact that mid-word crash got recorded, and today it's a famous story among people who study the network's history. The two technicians had to restart everything, and it was only a little while later that they managed to send the full word. The first message on the internet wasn't some elegant email. It was half a word, an LO. And on top of that, the system crashed right away, and that's a full hour of lies torn to pieces. Tell me in the comments, which one was the hardest for you to let go of? Hit like and subscribe. See you next time.